Well, thank you so much to everyone who's joining us tonight. I'd like to welcome you to the New York Financial Writers Association webinar. This is our second reporting club event, and tonight our guest is Ava Kaufman of Propublica. For those who are joining us for the first time, I'm Olivia Carville. I'm on the board of NIFWA, and we're the oldest financial journalism organisation in the country. Every year we hand out scholarships to aspiring financial writers, and we also host regular events for our members. And this month we've invited Ava on to talk to you all about a story she recently published in Propublica. It's called "We Don't Even Know Who Is Dead or Alive, Trapped Inside an Assisted Living Facility During the Pandemic." So welcome, Ava, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm hoping that pretty much everyone who's on this call has read this piece, but in case you haven't, the story takes us inside one of the hardest hit assisted living facilities in New York and the toll that the COVID-19 pandemic has taken on its residents, both those who succumbed to the virus and those who survived. So just to kick off, Ava, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your own background in reporting and how you ended up at Propublica writing stories like this.
Sure. I started at Propublica almost 2 years ago now. And before that, I was actually freelance. I was working mostly as a contributing writer for The Intercept, covering kind of tech and surveillance tech in particular, but also writing pieces on kind of a variety of things, doing some book reviews and other fun things like that on the side that you can do as a freelancer, and joined Propublica to cover tech, which had been, my beat, previously, and have since then kind of expanded to covering the pandemic and the kind of economic crisis unfolding from that.
Great. And Propublica is known for its investigative journalism. Obviously, it's one of the best outlets out there. Had that been a goal for you, like doing investigative stories and large enterprise pieces like this? Is that where you'd always imagined you'd end up?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, I think doing long stories that made an impact, whether or not they kind of fit into a traditional investigative rubric, had always been something I wanted to do, and had always been something that had also been, like for many people, really intimidating. And I was lucky enough to start to kind of dip my toes into what that might look like, or how to even get started, asking questions that actually no one knows the answer to, instead of doing the kind of more explanatory journalism that I and other young journalists are usually accustomed to doing through the Nation Institute, which is now called Type Investigations. And so I worked as a fact checker for them, and through doing that was kind of asked, hey, do you have any ideas of your own? And started kind of pitching through there in a freelance capacity. So it was only that someone was willing to give me the money and the time to be funded to kind of look into questions that weren't as quick hits, that I kind of built up the confidence and courage to start taking on bigger projects, especially freelance.
Nice. That's great. And so you said that your beat at Propublica is actually tech, but this isn't really a tech story at all. So I'm wondering, how did you come about writing this?
At the start of the pandemic, we all got shuffled around, and it was kind of like all hands on deck. How are we going to cover this? What is even happening, especially, like at all newsrooms based in New York City. And we were looking for more stories. It started really general, just about the human toll. There's so much coverage, about the kind of numbers and stuff, but who are some of the people behind these statistics? Of course, that kind of question or assignment is usually the one you can kind of like scratch your head about. And, there's so many stories you can do like that. You can end up kind of not ending up with much. But I started calling around just some advocates. We had a really great tip line of just people writing into us with, all kinds of crazy and horrifying situations, especially in March and April and May in New York, and ended up connecting with a woman who said, hey, there's a facility, and people keep telling me there's 30 to 40 people had died. And of course, we were starting to see numbers like that, in various clusters across the country, but in mid-April, that was still a lot of people, even compared to the other facilities that had started to be reported on. So I started to make some calls, originally thinking that this was a story about, a really high death toll, in the Bronx, and the way it had been, covered up or not covered up. And as I started to talk to residents, I realized there was actually a different story there, and one that was way more unfamiliar than just, how many people have died here, a lot of people, which was a horrible story, but one we were kind of seeing over and over again. It was that they didn't really know how many people had died. And the not knowing was really, really scary. And, they started to kind of tell me about what it was like to survive as your roommate just disappears. And, in some cases, your roommate comes back, a couple of weeks later, but no one told you that was going to happen. And in other cases, they would just never see this person again. And that led me to think that there was a story that needed to be done kind of about the survivors in these places where there were massive outbreaks, and putting some faces kind of to the statistics. There were so many stories about elder care, but very few stories that even had a single voice of an elderly person in them. And so that was the kind of genesis for, beginning to report this piece.
Well, that's great. And I'd love to get into more details about that pitching process and why you chose Bronxwood. I do just want to say, for those who are on the call, if you do have a question for Ava, feel free to write it in the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom call, and I'll be happy to ask her as we go along. So I think, one of the biggest takeaways I had from the piece is just the complexity of gathering these statistics. And there was a bit in there where you talked about how New York State gathers its statistics on assisted living facilities different to other states around the country. And I wonder if you could give us a bit of insight into what it was like for you as a journalist trying to dive into this unknown territory and figure out who's collecting the right statistics, and if you're comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges, and how you wade through all that noise.
Sure. I mean, yeah, part of the theme of the story is just that, there's an absence of the communication at the facility, and there's an absence of communication from the state. And there's an also, emotional absence that these residents feel. And in all of these cases, the problems are, the kind of same and kind of compounded on these different structural levels. And as a journalist, I was dealing with the same problem, the same absence of data that basically every journalist trying to cover long-term care in New York State dealt with, which is that unlike every other state in the country, if you die at, if your death is attributed to an elder care facility, nursing home, or assisted living, but you die at the hospital, it won't be counted as part of whatever facility you were living in. And that is a really odd way of counting deaths. Not only does no one else do it that way, but we would not do that for gun violence. If someone was, transferred to a different hospital in a different borough with a, trauma from a gun-inflicted wound, we wouldn't say, that death happened in New York City if they had been shot in the Bronx. And so, but that is what's happening with coronavirus deaths. And so, I didn't really have to do anything magical with the data except kind of go through it every couple of days. I would check to see if Bronxwood was on the list, because we knew people were dying there, not everyone of the virus, but at least some people were, according to staff and residents, and continue to see that it kind of hadn't shown up there. And so, like everyone else, I filed FOIL requests asking for the number of deaths that happened, outside the facility, but of residents, from residents who'd lived there, which is something that we all know that the state has. It's been delayed multiple times. Advocates have filed for much larger batches of documents. And state legislators, in the course of my reporting process, also began to think that this was ridiculous. I mean, there'd been plenty of news articles about this policy. And so, they began to ask questions of the health department that, I, as a reporter, had wanted to ask. And so I was able to summarize those debates and kind of back and forth a bit about the data in the piece.
There was a great paragraph in this story that read, as of mid-November, there have been more than 6,619 virus-related deaths within the state's nursing homes and 179 in its adult care facilities, according to official data. Bronxwood, however, has never appeared in that tally. Then you went on to say that even Bronxwood employees have said they've had residents die from COVID inside the facility. That's a pretty powerful and striking statistic. Did you feel at all as you were writing this piece out, because I think the way in which another outlet that may not have been as focused on long-term or investigative reporting might have wanted to push, paragraphs like that up closer to the top, almost like a nut graph? And how did you decide about kind of weaving this into the narrative rather than going in on that as one of the lead numbers?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. That probably is something we could have put higher in a different piece. I felt it was important to kind of spell out the policy before we explained why it was so significant that this facility that, there was all this kind of hearsay and rumor about wasn't showing up on an official list. And doing that up top, I think would have pulled focus away from the fact that I wanted it to be really clear from the start that this was a story from the point of view, as close as possible to do so, over the phone and so on, from these residents, and to kind of market generically as a different type of piece than the ones you've been reading. Because what was new was this kind of human experience, I thought, and the texture that these lives added to all of our understandings of what it's really like to be locked down and to be without this data. And starting with those statistics, I think might have also signaled that this is just another piece about the numbers.
Right. And it's so important to give like a face behind some of those statistics as well, which is what your piece definitely did. Before we dive into some of your specific kind of reporting and writing processes, I wonder, there's so much news out there right now. 2020 has given us the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, the presidential election, and it can feel sometimes like your stories are just a drop in the bucket and they're relevant for a couple of hours before something else comes out. So how did you decide that this was worthwhile to kind of hit the pause button and say, no, I really want to focus on this one facility and do a deep dive here? How do you know when you've got a worthwhile story that is, it's worth your investment of time and resources?
That's such a good question. I mean, I don't know that it was always clear, but to me, I was so compelled by the people I was talking to. I think it's really rare. I mean, the more and more people you speak with as a journalist, the more you realize how lucky and privileged you are when you come across people who can describe what they're going through with such insight and specificity. So many people have, all kinds of tragedies happen to them, but it's rare to find people who can also narrate, that with a sense of, understanding. And what they were making me understand felt so important and different than what was in most of the news coverage. At least to me, I was so interested in it. What is it like to, be entrusted to this institution that's completely indifferent to you during this time? And they were going through the same lockdown experience as, I was. We were both locked down in the same city. And yet, it could not have been, more different in terms of, how that felt and what was happening. And so I think it was just that kind of human interest that really propelled me to want to kind of keep going. And the more elder care became, an evident crisis, the high, the plurality of deaths in this country and around the world, the more it seemed, as increasingly urgent to have elderly voices, explaining that toll. But I was juggling this piece alongside other pieces, so I never did kind of pause either.
Well, I also feel like you wrote a piece that really gets to the heart of this facility, and you introduce us to some incredible characters and have some incredible details in this story as well. But you would have reported this from home, I assume. Like, how does your reporting process as an investigative journalist who's trying to do a deep dive on this assisted living facility change now that we're in a pandemic and you're no longer in the office and probably didn't even have access to this building, I assume?
Yeah, so there was like no access to the inside for, very obvious safety reasons. And, sometimes you don't get access to a building, and as a journalist, you try to find a way of pushing it. But this was, quite clear cut. No one should go in. And I was, just kind of starting with talking to people on the phone. Some of the residents had cell phones. Sometimes their numbers would change and I would call them each room had a landline. So that was a great advantage. And, most people were home all the time. So I benefited from, what most reporters did during this time, which is like everyone's picking up the phone 100 times more often, I found. And then through those kind of phone conversations, which often went, really long, I did eventually kind of schedule some times to meet up with people outside. The facility is not in a kind of walkable neighborhood with there's not many parks that are reachable for, people who don't want to, get on a bus or walk quite a while. So we would just kind of sit on the sidewalk or perched on kind of stairs. It wasn't the most, sit kind of in someone's car sometimes. It wasn't the most kind of comfortable experience, but it worked really well to just kind of gain a little more, have them see that I was a real person. And you can have such freer conversations sometimes when you're not on the phone. So that's kind of how we did it.
Right. I noticed that this story was a collaboration with the New Republic and with Propublica, and that Propublica tends to do a lot of these collaborations with other local news outlets, which is great for local reporting. But what does that actually mean for the story and for, the editing process? What role did the New Republic have here?
Yeah, it's great that we do collaborations, and sometimes the collaboration will be with an outlet that is hyper local because that story is taking place in a really specific city or district, and we want it to reach the readers who it affects. In this case, because it was a more featurey magazine story, the New Republic made a lot of sense as a partner. And while sometimes ProPublica does the primary work, and then we'll hand it, sometimes the work is shared between both outlets. Sometimes it's mostly us, and the kind of partner comes in at the end as a kind of distribution partner. And in this case, it was a little unusual. The New Republic did the kind of primary edit and kind of read of the story and help me kind of get it into shape. And then, we all put it out together.
Nice. And we do have a question here from a colleague of mine, Peter Coy, who's also on the board of the Financial Writers Association. He's asking about ProPublica's training programs. I know at Bloomberg we have an internship program and a rotator program to kind of introduce young journalists into financial news reporting. I'm wondering, does ProPublica have something similar, or what are the training programs inside your organization?
Yeah, we have a fellows program. So that's for younger journalists. We have usually about 4 fellows a year. 2 of them are actually for business writers, in particular, business reporters. So if anyone on this call, I'm assuming there's young business reporters on this call, those are special grants for people interested on that beat. And we also do a lot of mentorship programs for younger journalists. So a younger journalist will mentor with someone in the newsroom and be sent to a bunch of conferences, I think, of their choice. And then there's also something for data journalists, which is, I'd love to be mentored in that program, far out of my field, and a lot of funding, I think, as well for diversity scholarships and conferences too, which I haven't attended any conferences yet, but seems like that's something that's been really ongoing, and sometimes those people end up working at ProPublica in later years too.
Great, thank you. And so now if we could kind of start talking a little bit about how you began the reporting process here with this story. So you say that you got this tip to look into this one facility where there had been a lot of deaths of residents. And then how did you, from getting that tip to starting to report, where did you begin, and how did you find the numbers for residents or even know who to call?
Yeah, it just started out with one name. The advocate, works closely with residents at a variety of facilities, and there's a bunch of different kind of peer programs and stuff that the Coalition for the Institutionalized and Disabled runs. They're one of 2 advocacy groups in the city. And so I was put in touch with a peer mentor who works with them and lives at Bronxwood, and she started to kind of tell me about what she was seeing and just what it was like to kind of stay alive with this grief, and how she hadn't even had time to really grieve yet and wasn't sure when she'd be able to kind of make that time. And we had a pretty kind of deep conversation, right from the start. And so the next obvious question was just, who else can I talk to? And began to kind of build a roster of people. I put their room numbers in, and everyone has a friend, a different best friend who's not the same as the mutual friend who they introduced me to. And so I was able to build up, over a dozen people who I talked to more than once. And of course, the main characters in the story I talked to many, many times over the course of, around 7 months, on the phone and in person. But with other people, I would also, different people have different levels of comfort. And sometimes I would just kind of want to check things out. So a lot of the reporting process too is making sure that if someone had a complaint about the building, is that idiosyncratic? Is that something that's just happening to them, or is this widespread? And if this is happening at Bronxwood, can I check to see if this is happening at other facilities? Even though this was about one building, I wanted to make sure that the details that I was choosing to include, even though each detail isn't bracketed this way, were in fact representative of what happens in adult homes. So that this was about far more than something that can be written off as specific to this management or this little corner of the city. That this was an effort to kind of expose the systemic mistreatment and kind of continued neglect that happens in this particular strain of elder care.
Yeah, I feel like you did a really good job at introducing Bronxwood as almost like a case study for the wider problem. And I feel like that's definitely a takeaway you get as a reader. I thought that this was just a fascinating paragraph where you said less than 1% of Americans reside in long-term care facilities, a category that includes nursing homes and assisted living residences. But these facilities account for around 40% of the country's COVID deaths. And researchers caution that this figure represents an undercount. You went on to say that many states do not publish this data or do so incompletely, and fewer than half of all states report cases in assisted living facilities. Like, that's some pretty incredible statistics. What was it like for you as you were going through that reporting process and figuring all this out, and just how kind of complex this issue was?
Yeah, I mean, there'd been so much reporting on nursing homes, and nursing homes are federally regulated. And so, they're really difficult to report on in a lot of ways, but at the same time, there's CMS data and you can, pull inspection reports really easily. Assisted living, I had not reported on anything related to elder care before. And part of what's fun about a new subject is what kind of strikes you as you're learning it the first time, you hope will also strike the reader. You have that kind of new sense of like, oh, that kind of live wire in you that might dull if it's your beat. But part of what's so crazy about assisted living is that it's unregulated. I had no idea this was the case. And so looking into the kind of wild, west of elder care led to a slightly different story than what we had kind of already been told about what was happening in nursing homes. I mean, it's a group of residents that was kind of just as sick. I didn't know that was the case. And, often being handled by not medically trained staff. And in this case, I think what really struck me and what I hope to kind of get across in looking at inspection data and talking to advocates and lawyers who, worked much more broadly just on these homes as an issue, pre-pandemic, is that this is a group of seniors and people who were quarantined in a lot of ways by society before the pandemic. They were quarantined because they were old, and they were quarantined because they were poor, and they were kind of left, already quite vulnerable in these institutions, and they were already stuck there because they had nowhere else to go. And when I had first started reporting on the home, I thought this was just about the lockdown and the pandemic. And then it became, the pandemic is actually a difference of, degree or so, not of kind, in terms of the situations these people had already been living through.
Mm-hmm. And how did you build up trust with the residents when you first started talking to them? You said that you were initially talking to the person who reached out to Propublica, obviously, who was, willing to speak to a reporter. But when you're calling, people cold and explaining who you are and the kind of information you're wanting, I can imagine that would be quite scary for some of these people to receive a call like that. So how did you go about explaining who you were, what you were doing, and not scaring them off. So building trust and rapport with them.
Yeah, in this case, I mean, I think people were, um, quite upset with what that was happening to them. It wasn't the kind of story, there's sometimes stories where you're kind of, convincing, someone to talk to you and your interests might not quite align. But, there'd been there's so little outreach to people in these facilities that just having someone who wanted to kind of listen, and I think, they could hear that I was really genuinely curious, not to just kind of check off a list of questions. I mean, I had certain things I wanted to know, and I wanted to confirm that everyone could tell me, to make sure that they were true. But I also wanted to have really rambling, open-ended conversations and to hear, what most upset them. And I think, yeah, I was, kind of lucky enough that, this story and the way I wanted to tell it kind of, already aligned with the fact that a lot of people wanted this story to be told. So it wasn't difficult in that sense.
Did you find at all that you were becoming quite closely connected to some of these residents and almost taking on a role as like an advocate for them to try and publish a story that highlighted their plight and all of the problems they were facing? Because some of these individuals just come across as so helpless. And how do you distinguish yourself as like a reporter who's trying to tell a really good story, but at the same time trying to almost be like a sounding board or a counselor for some of these individuals who are really struggling and going through a pretty horrific grieving process?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that it can be tricky in so many situations, and you also, do want to be really friendly and also make it clear that you're not someone's friend, so that they don't, tell you something that they don't actually want, to be made public in this way that's, quite personal. Um, in this case, I I'm not sure what I said to communicate that. I mean, it was always really I always made it really clear that I wanted to, you know, I was always quite straightforward about what the story was. I want to tell your story because it's really important and it's not being told. And as I said, that kind of aligned with what was already, going through their heads, which is, no one's listening to us. We have no idea what's going on. Like, can we get answers? So I think those incentives were aligned. And as for friendship, I mean, all of the women and men who I spoke to are just incredibly resourceful people, and were able, to do and figure out a lot of stuff on their own. And I think I was helpful as a sounding board emotionally, and someone to listen to. But it never kind of became a situation in which I was, an advocate. The advocacy organizations do such a good job already about that in New York City and with outreach, that a lot of them kind of already knew who to reach out to if they needed someone who was more like legal counsel, or, a health advocate, or something more material than, a journalist who, was definitely willing to listen to complaints about, the food for a very long time and so on.
Right. And I assume that some of these residents that you spoke to, this may have been their first time ever talking to a reporter or being involved in a news story. And how much background or context did you give them as you were interviewing them? Because I can imagine that some of these interviews or conversations may have gone on for like an hour at least, and then they read the story and maybe they've kind of only a couple of sentences or don't even feature in the piece at all. So did you explain that what the process was going to be like after they talked to you? Or did you feel like you just kind of gathered as much information as you could, and then we're going to just publish the story and reach out to them afterwards? Or how did you explain or kind of prepare them for what was to come?
I called everyone to do fact-checking calls before the story was published, so that there would be kind of no surprises in terms of, reading back paraphrases of what they had said to me that, appeared in the final version. And also just kind of, final checking some things and checking the spelling of their names, like making sure it was just kind of clear for a final time, like this is going into print. Like I think sometimes when you're working on something for so long, it can kind of, it seems to you and like sometimes to other people, like, it's just like some sort of art project, like you're not sure if it'll ever kind of materialize. And so those fact checking calls I find also really important, and kind of just reminding the person, like, I know I've just been calling you for so long, but a real story's happening. It's going to come out on this date. Like, I'll send you the issue afterwards. I tend not to go too into detail with anyone for stories about how big or little their role is. I've never kind of gotten feedback on that before, being an issue. Maybe I've been lucky to just have like really gracious, main sources. But I always made it clear whatever information that was coming from them that was attributable to them, was appearing in the story.
And what was the reaction to this story? Did the residents who featured in it reach out to you?
They did. Some of them did. I heard really positive feedback from Veron, who wants to kind of continue. She's the main subject in the story and was the president of the residence council at this facility and wants to continue being an elder care advocate. So she's really excited to kind of share this story, with other, people in the kind of new community she's living in order to, continue to kind of do this work that she's been really excited about. So that was great. And I've talked to some of the other residents since about, just what's going on. It seems like the main administrator who was named in the story, he was the only kind of face of the organization that they were provided, and, that I was, de facto provided, directed to his voicemail and so on. And he's left. I don't know if he was fired or not yet. But that was a kind of interesting outcome that I'd heard about. And I don't know if anyone's gotten a chance to kind of see it in print yet, but those copies have been mailed to them. So I'll be looking forward to that feedback as well.
Nice. Veron definitely is your main character in the piece. She's clearly the protagonist who kind of carries the story. Why did you choose to focus on her in particular?
I always find it so compelling, reading other people's stories when there's a character who's both, so buffeted by whatever circumstances are the subject of the piece, but is also working in some way to try to kind of improve or advocate for change. And it was so, I think, just moving and fascinating to me personally to hear about Veron's, interest in running for city council and the way that those plans had been derailed by the pandemic. They were both plans that were really specific to her, but plans that we could all kind of relate to. Everyone had probably something, probably not as important in most cases, in the next year that they really wanted to do or had been kind of planning on building towards. And that her personal journey, which I got to learn about as we got to know each other, just seemed really inherently compelling. But to speak to your point about her being the protagonist, at first, it wasn't clear to me if I was going to tell the story through multiple people's perspectives. And it soon became obvious that because everyone was in the same building and kind of experiencing the same thing, that might have led to like a really repetitive structure. And so we kind of condense everything that was happening to everyone, in the body and in the vehicle of like one person's journey.
Mm-hmm. You did get some incredible details from the residents in this piece, and also some amazing quotes. Like, two of my favorites were, "I feel stripped naked, like we're getting ready for the slaughterhouse, and we don't even know who is dead or alive." Did you find, as you were interviewing all these individuals, that there was a particular question or way you framed a question that managed to elicit a really insightful response, or a response where they went into some of the details that you actually ended up including in the piece?
I think the credit in that case goes actually all to them and speaks to your question about kind of why I wanted to do this story and how it was kind of clear that this was maybe a place to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
It was calling people who spoke in such precise and, often heartbreaking language about kind of what they were witnessing, and were so able to both bear witness and convey that made me want to just kind of keep talking to them. And kind of listening for that. But it was really hard to choose quotes because I felt like every transcript I had, and I had, I don't know, like almost 100, I don't know, not 100 hours maybe, but so many hours, dozens,
Mm-hmm.
certainly. Yeah, I mean, there's every line felt like it was like that.
Mm-hmm. Varan in particular, your insights into what was happening in her life were really heartbreaking, and I feel like they would have resonated with anyone who has a loved one who's inside an assisted living facility or a nursing home. One of the paragraphs that I really enjoyed, you wrote, as the lockdown dragged on, Varan felt herself sliding into a depression. Before March, she was always out with a client or at some community meeting. Now she was eating 3 meals a day on a rectangular folding table at the edge of her bed. She was gaining weight from staying inside. Her feet were swollen, her back hurt. Did you, as you were writing this out, try and imagine like how other people may feel reading this and that they may relate it to their own loved ones, or kind of see beyond just this one individual and relate it to other people or anyone who's living inside a facility like this?
Yeah, definitely. And so many of the questions of, do I stay here? Do I go? Where would I even go? Originally I was writing this story before the presidential election. It just, happened to come out after, but there is a big question of, how do you hold an election during a pandemic, which was the same question the residents were facing about their own smaller election. They were electing a new president for the resident council. And so there's all of these kind of echoes or similarities or, kind of metonyms, I think, within the facility with what everyone, certainly in New York City, was going through in some way.
So do you feel like a lot of this piece kind of hinges on just how great the talent was in terms of individuals like Varan, who were able to really describe to you in such graphic detail how their lives were impacted?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I hadn't really done a piece before where it was so clear that just, if I could do justice to how compelling and brilliant and sensitive these individuals were, like that would be, at least I thought, with storytelling and structure and pacing, if I could make my interest interesting to other people, that was what I was kind of trying to do with the piece.
And what about approaching the facility? Like, you clearly state in the piece that repeated calls to Bronxwood were not returned. When did you first approach them to say you were working on this? And how many times did you try and call?
Yeah, so the piece ran November 30th, the end of November, and I first approached them in certainly by mid-September. I want to say even early September. And, starting with a detailed list of questions, giving them as much basically time as possible to respond, and then just calling every single number. I mean, it's a big facility with many different managers that you can call on the, phone menu. And so called everyone over and over again, continued to email, did everything short of going inside the building, which in normal times would have been the really obvious thing to do, and might have yielded at least some sort of response, even if it's like, please go outside, which would have been better. I mean, I would have loved to kind of hear their side of things and to understand their perspective on, how everyone else, in the building that at least I spoke to seemed to kind of feel about how it was being handled. And, their view of the data would have been really interesting and valuable to have as well. I mean, they're not in charge of what the health department is doing. That's a kind of different system failure. And what do they make of that? But I did make sure that my messages had gone through, because sometimes you want to also just feel like all of the detailed, comments and no surprises, the questions, you make sure that, they see every single fact go through. And so I have some like read receipts and made sure the LinkedIn messages went through and so on, so that at least I knew, despite continued silence, that I wasn't actually had the wrong email or something like that.
And did you ever go beyond like LinkedIn and sending email messages to the main line and like try and call the directors on their home lines, or try and door knock them, or try any other paths kind of beyond the norm to get a comment?
I didn't door knock anyone. It seemed like not the best thing to do in the pandemic if they were already kind of not responding. I had given them all of the information that was going into the piece quite early. So they had had a long time to kind of see everything and work through it and respond. So at a certain point after, asking the front desk, and telling them, they would talk to me, right? But so explaining to them I was writing a story and stuff, and kind of being put through to voicemail, and emailing, all the various emails I can find. We didn't end up kind of going to the in-person route, but
right, because I feel like it's relatively normal to receive, no comment. We don't want to provide any information on this story, or we have privacy concerns about this. But to get total radio silence when you're working on a big piece like this and speaking to so many residents must be quite frustrating.
Yeah, it is. Though there's been like various stories about kind of different misdeeds at Bronxwood in the past. BuzzFeed had a good story about Bronxwood like a couple months prior. They also didn't get any comment. I think they might have gotten one response through a lawyer about a specific lawsuit. So I had seen that they just don't comment. Like there'd been like a serious audit that they, from I'm forgetting the name, the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General, that they didn't respond to when there was a story about it. So that kind of made me feel like this was their MO.
Mm-hmm. And if you could try and step out of your role as the journalist who actually researched and wrote this piece and think about this question in like a way where you're not involved like that, do you think it would have been in Bronxwood's best interests to comment publicly? And how would you, say you were advising them on PR, what would you say if you were receiving emails like the ones that you send? How would you suggest they reply?
I'm not sure. I mean, usually when you do this kind of story, you get, I've gotten radio silence before actually, but sometimes you get some sort of blanket statement that speaks to kind of, that won't address every single point. I mean, when you do this kind of style of investigation, you can end up sending the facility like, 40 questions. Some places go ham and like really like to get back to you, and others will give you a kind of general blanket statement about how there's some sort of big privacy concern, protecting the well-being and caring for residents is like the top priority. I mean, there's kind of foreign language that you see in all of these pieces. But I don't know, from a PR perspective. I mean, I think also perhaps ignoring when something like this happens makes it go away more quickly, or makes the person who responded to it less likely to be liable, or I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm. What was your reporting process like? How long did it take from pitching to publishing, and how did you go about keeping track of all of your notes and interviews and keeping them in order?
Yeah, it took a long time, but not really because of the story, just because of external circumstances. Like, this was something I kind of worked on the side. My beat was to cover unemployment this year for the most part. So I was working on unemployment stories as my main thing and kind of churning those out and doing this kind of little by little, and ended up writing it when there was a good kind of 2-week break to kind of like take a vacation to do so. And in terms of kind of what the process was like, I mean, just a lot of calls and checking in, a lot of cross-checking, as I mentioned before. So any detail that's in the story that's not just like, someone's back hurt is usually sourced by, at least another resident. But often, I also saw that people didn't like the food because there's like formal complaints about it, or, it's not just kind of man on the street, cries about, something happening to him kind of thing. And used Scrivener. I don't know if you or other people on this call use this app, but it's pretty incredible. You can kind of search through the notes you take. It's all in like one interface, and then you can draft by section, but the search function is really the best part, and so is the ability to kind of take snapshots of your draft. So that has changed my life, and I recommend you buy or expense Scrivener for compiling notes. Because, for instance, if I was looking for everyone who had talked about the stimulus check, instead of opening 10 different Word documents just to be like boring and more specific about this, I can search the word stimulus and it'll like kind of show me like highlighted like that Deborah and Sal and Veron and Glenda all talked about the stimulus, and then it'll show me where in each interview. So I can immediately kind of get all the quotes about it, like construct a scene. If I talk to multiple people about the same thing happening in like the stairwell, I could search the word stairwell and so on.
That sounds like a great tool.
Yeah.
The information on the stimulus check was fascinating, about how, for those who may not have read this piece, you said that Bronxwood was not giving residents their stimulus checks, and complaints about missing or partial stimulus checks were so widespread throughout the city's facilities that the state had issued a guidance saying residents' money belonged to residents. Um, did you view this particular part of the story as like potentially another area to look into? Because I feel like this is such a fascinating insight, that was kind of buried in the current piece because it came so far down. But the thought that, a facility would withhold or take part of a stimulus check was something I hadn't really read before. So I was interested if this was like something that you're going to flag or maybe look into in the future.
Yeah, it definitely could have been its own breakout news story. And this, it kind of became part of the storytelling. It became less, it's an accountability detail, right? This is like wrongdoing. I mean, there eventually was some reporting about it, but when I first heard the residents telling me about it, we didn't know it was widespread. There wasn't, it was quite early on when this was just surfacing, and it could have just been spun out as a story. But in the surface of the narrative, it became a way of being like, oh, well, this is a really interesting scene about like a problem everyone is facing in quarantine. And here's a little story, or, miniature scene, as much as we can reconstruct scenes like over the telephone, about what all of these different people who met together in the stairwell kind of decided to do about it. So I decided to kind of use that as a moment to show, how people were trying to kind of like cope and build their own, better society within this building that was kind of shortchanging them, for lack of a better word. But that is a good example of like the cross-checking. Like, I didn't know to ask people, are you not getting your stimulus checks? Because we didn't know that wasn't happening at first. Just kept coming up in the calls. People, so first you hear a complaint about it and you don't really understand it. And then you say, oh, that could be interesting. And I started to ask everyone about it. Are you also having trouble? No, but my neighbor is. Or, oh, I only got it in $100 bills and I can't spend those. Everyone kind of had a different thing. And that itself was like interesting. But I was like, if this is only happening at Bronxwood, like, how real is this? Could it have just been a misunderstanding? Giving the facility a benefit of the doubt. Did someone just get the wrong amount because, of taxes, or, there's all kinds of, are they keeping it because they're guardians of their money? And then once I started talking to advocates, they said, we're hearing this too. And I got on a call with advocates and residents at a bunch of different facilities as part of a meeting they had. And that was like one of the main issues. And then it became, okay, this is something I can put in the story. This is actually an issue. This isn't, a random fact or something like that.
Just want to put out a reminder to those who are on the call that we have about 10 minutes to go. So if there's any questions that you want to put to Ava, feel free to write them in the chat function and I'll make sure to ask before we wrap up. Just on that kind of subject of all of the different details you had in the piece, from the stimulus checks to the data to the way New York collects its or collates its death tally compared to other states, and then the personal story of Varan, like that's weaving together lots of different pieces of information into like a really well-read kind of narrative feature story. How do you go about sitting down and actually writing a story like this out? I feel like you mentioned maybe 100 minutes worth of transcripts or worth of interviews that you had to go through and using this app Scrivener. But when you've got so much information that you've collated over such a long period of time, what's your process of sitting down and visualizing the story and coming up with the arc and how you're going to actually tell it?
Yeah, the first thing I do is I always kind of read over all of my notes, and I did a combination of kind of like self-transcription using an automated transcription app, and then using Rev for a couple interviews that I knew were really special and I wanted to get like every word of, but that's quite expensive to do. So a combination of those things, and just reading all of that through with all of the notes and interviews with any expert sources I've done, and starting to kind of make these buckets. I still use Scrivener for that, so I'll just like, some of the documents are really small, like there might be a document just called like stimulus checks within this app, and it'll just have like every time someone mentioned that, and seeing if there's enough or it's interesting. Another will be about like the lockdown and what people's experience of the lockdown was like. Another was about New York State, I think. Another was about the institution, like what's this institution like? What is an adult home? What's assisted living? And those started to kind of become sections. Some of them didn't. Some of them were quite minor and became a sentence or a paragraph or like left entirely. Others, like, I had all this information about Varan kind of driving around, that became a smaller part of a section. But it's a lot of just kind of guessing. I mean, the structure ultimately is quite conventional, but I did not like actually understand what I was doing until I put everything together. It's, someone's journey of kind of arriving. I mean, it starts late, right? It starts with the outbreak, and then it's someone arriving at the place and eventually making a decision, being stuck and eventually making a decision to leave. And it's a kind of escape narrative, journey of escape kind of contrasted to a journey of being stuck for some of the other people still there, and someone having a goal. But at the start, it was just kind of a mass of details, and getting there is usually just kind of like cutting documents down smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm. And what about your editing process? We've had another question come through asking about, what did your first draft look like compared to what did your published piece look like?
My first draft started chronologically. So it started with Ron going to the facility, a year earlier before the pandemic, and still ended with her leaving. And my editor at the New Republic, Emily Cook, very wisely said, we need to start kind of with the pandemic and start late. And so I ended up moving the backstory of her kind of getting there down and opening with a description of the facility and the way it was kind of transforming and introducing all of those themes kind of in a really tight, I wanted it to feel almost like a prelude or like a short kind of prologue up top, where you have this idea of not knowing, of people disappearing, of this place that might have kind of once been joyous and had a library and a theater room kind of shutting down, and getting all those themes there really quickly and then going back to the beginning.
I thought that the section where you have, I think it's Mr. Stern, the head of the facility, talking to Varan, and he said, what's an intelligent woman like you doing living in a place like this? And then you wrote that this question flattered her, but it also unsettled her, as if she wasn't wanted or didn't belong, because she was pushing back on the facility, because she was asking questions about the stimulus check or pushed to get more clothing for the residents of the facility. And that's quite a frightening insight into how some of these places are run, that individuals who, do have a lot of power and a sense of like wanting to help other residents and create, in effect, like a union or a council that can push for more resources, are effectively seen as rebel rousers by those who run the facilities, or seen as a problem rather than help. And how did you feel about that? Because I thought that was quite a significant takeaway from the piece, that individuals like Varan are actually cause for concern for places like Bronxwood.
Yeah, it was so interesting in reporting it to see the way in which this kind of congregate living facility acts like a miniature political institution. It has its own electoral politics. There's a lot of intrigue. I mean, I think a different version of this story would have been an oral history, where you really hear like everyone's voices and all of the kind of fragmented. I mean, there's so much drama and debates. It's a group of adults living with each other. I mean, what else would you, and having to kind of share decision making. What else would you expect? And so I think that, the fact that there's retaliation, even if it's tacit, and subterfuge was, ultimately not that surprising as I got kind of deeper and deeper into the kind of gossip and kind of smaller dramas, pandemic aside, and politics that, didn't all make it into the story because it would have been really tedious after a while. But yeah, I think it's a really I think settings like this are quite rich and dramatic institutions just in their own right, crisis aside.
One of those small dramas that I personally found quite entertaining in the piece was how Varan was trying to attend these council meetings on Zoom, which is something that we all had to deal with in the pandemic, is like learning how to, run your life and your professional life virtually or through your laptop. And her roommate was selling cigarettes on the side, and how she'd like be selling these cigarettes at her door while she's trying to be in a a classroom environment and learn. And I thought that that was a really cool insight into just how difficult it can be living in situations like this, and also something that a lot of readers could probably relate to.
Yeah, and I had no idea reporting this that almost everyone in that building and in most of buildings that house low income seniors had a roommate. And that obviously was like the dominant complaint. I mean, even if people had nice roommates, I mean, I spent so long talking to kind of everyone about their roommate. And that seemed like an added dimension that was like important to, I didn't want to rag on the roommate too much, but to kind of highlight and get out there. What do you do when you're not only stuck, but you're stuck in the same room with someone who's not your partner? I mean, it's crazy.
Or not even a family member or a friend.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty horrible situation. One of the things I thought as I was reading the piece, because the description was so good, and your way of describing the rooms and how they have two single beds and two dressers and two chest of drawers for two individuals who stay in these rooms, I couldn't help but thinking, like, I wish I could see what it looked like. I wish I could see the decor. I wish that there had been some visual element or some video to take us inside the facility, to look at the hallways. You describe one hallway as like cappuccino colored hallway and this resident pacing, or you also talked about how the theatre room doors were padlocked, how some residents' belongings were left in the kitchen and people didn't know if they were dead or alive. And now with journalism, we are all multimedia reporters. We all have to think about more than just the words. We have to think about photos and videos and new ways of telling the story. But now in the pandemic, we're so limited in our ability to do that. I wonder, had we not been in the middle of, COVID-19, do you think you would have tried to make this a bit more visual and tried to get access to the building, or get the residents to take video on their own cameras or send you pictures of their rooms? Is that something that you thought about during the reporting, or were you really focused on getting the words and the text right?
I think I definitely should have sent everyone disposable cameras. I mean, some people sent me a few pictures that they had taken on their phones, but the quality was just not great. It wasn't great enough to put in the actual story, but it helped me describe things like the library having all this junk in it. Like, that was a picture I'd gotten, or these posters. One thing I really liked about this that I hope to carry into reporting when I do, get to go inside a facility or hang out in someone's room or house, and enjoy the kind of privileges of that, both as a writer and a person getting to see a new world, is it made me so much more attuned to visual detail to not have all of my senses working. So when someone did tell me something that was really specific, or I saw something in one of the photos I was able to grasp, or all of the photos I found online of the facility, some of which were dated, and so I had to kind of fact check that I was describing something that was still painted the same way or whatever. It became so much richer because that sense was blocked, and so I was able to listen for that and try to ask for those details more than I might have normally if I was just kind of taking everything in and only noticing 1% of it.
Mm-hmm. And I know we're almost running out of time here, so we've got another question from an audience member, which is, what do you hope is the takeaway from this story that readers kind of carry with them once they closed out of it?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, understanding, as we were talking about, that Bronxwood has all of these issues, but they're also systemic issues that kind of represent the broader failure of elder care in this country. I mean, we have a major crisis of care, I mean, of childcare as well. But when it comes to old people, I think there's so much more work to be done in just explaining not only the financial kind of and medical costs of warehousing basically an entire segment of the population, but also the psychological toll. And so if this piece provided just a little more insight into kind of what it feels like to be told you don't matter, and what it feels like to have someone have made the decision that you're not worth kind of telling information to. They might even give more information to your families than they will to, the residents living inside this facility. Yeah, that to me is something that I hope kind of comes across.
I'm pretty sure that did resonate. Well, at least it certainly did for me. The final question I have for you is just if you could provide any advice to other young aspiring, maybe student reporters or junior reporters who are eager to work on enterprise pieces like this and don't really know where to start, what advice would you give?
I think, I guess it's always like a kind of evergreen recipe, but homing in on a place in which, it doesn't have to necessarily be the facility that's in the hardest hit borough, but if you see that there's a lot of statistics about kind of something happening, but not a lot of human stories, even if some of those are starting to be told, finding a kind of local version of that, like wherever you are, if resources, not being able to travel to report or having time to travel are a problem. If something's a big enough national issue, it's definitely happening somewhere nearby. And if you can find someone you have a connection with, they're a subject, but you feel a relationship with them and you feel like you can tell their story, like starting there can often be like an incredible window onto all sorts of bigger issues, especially if you wanted to kind of be more future-y or human interesty.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all your time, Ava. We really appreciate it. And on behalf of the New York Financial Writers Association and everyone who's joined tonight, just want to say that was a great conversation and you had so many really good insights for reporters who are listening in and those who are going to listen in the future, and really appreciate you taking the time tonight to talk us through that great story.